Hey, what's up, everybody? Steve Schwartz here from LSAT Unplugged, joining you today to share some common mistakes students make in LSAT logical reasoning and how to avoid them. The logical reasoning section of the LSAT is about to get a lot more important once LSAC removes the logic game section after the June 2024 LSAT. Starting with the August LSAT, they're going to replace the game section with a second scored logical reasoning section. What this means is that for those of you who might be taking the LSAT after the change, any improvements you make in logical reasoning will be doubled because it'll be two sections rather than one, and it will then comprise 2/3 of the LSAT, roughly 51 questions out of 75 or so. So, well worth devoting attention to this section. I'll be giving it increased importance in my upcoming videos over the next several months in preparation for the change. Now, you should know there are roughly 15 types of logical reasoning questions on the LSAT. We have inference, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, strengthen, weaken, pointed issue, resolve the paradox, parallel, and so on. However, some of these types are more common than others, so you should devote increased attention to those that are more common. The three biggest types of logical reasoning questions are flaw, necessary assumption, and inference. Sufficient assumption is different, of course, from necessary assumption, but is also far less common, so make sure you're devoting special attention to necessary assumption and, of course, distinguishing between the two. Now, most logical reasoning questions on the LSAT contain arguments rather than fact sets. A fact set is just a bunch of information with no conclusion or argument contained within. Rather, an argument, in contrast, is going to have evidence and conclusion, meaning they are making a claim based on certain supporting information. So you want to get really good at distinguishing between evidence and conclusion. There may be indicator words, of course. Because is an evidence indicator, and therefore or thus is a conclusion indicator. There are many, many others. I have cheat sheets and full lesson walkthroughs about this inside the LSAT Unplugged course. You can check out the links below this video to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd love to help you out. One other thing you want to get really good at is identifying common logical fallacies. I find that far too many students, just as they're jumping into answer choices without fully understanding the argument or the evidence versus the conclusion, they're also jumping into the choices not knowing what is the flaw or the gap within the argument. There are some classic logical fallacies like confusing necessary versus sufficient conditions, or confusing correlation for causation, or the author of the argument making an unreasonable appeal to authority, or an ad hominem personal attack, engaging in circular reasoning, equivocation, and such. There are roughly a dozen types of classic logical fallacies, including the ones I just mentioned, that show up consistently on the LSAT, so you want to make sure that you are familiar with these different classic fallacies. Not every argument on the LSAT will contain them. Some will just take something for granted or fail to consider something. But whatever the case, you want to make sure you are at least familiar with the most common fallacies that show up rather consistently. Now, I mentioned earlier, necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. A lot of students confuse these two question types when in reality they are asking for very different things. Necessary assumption questions should be viewed like a very specific kind of must-be true question, which means they are not really looking for new information. Rather, they are asking for something already required by the argument, meaning if you take the argument as given, you are then logically committed to believing all underlying necessary assumptions. This is why the so-called negation test works. The correct answer choice, when negated, destroys the argument, meaning it was required by the argument in order for the argument to function or work properly. In contrast, sufficient assumption questions are asking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. You can distinguish between these two question types based on the word or phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions contain words and phrases synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, and assumes. Sufficient assumption questions, in contrast, are containing words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, properly inferred if assumed, and properly drawn if assumed. Another common mistake I see students making on the LSAT is failing to distinguish in their approach between must be true questions, and most strongly supported questions. These both fall within the category of inference questions, broadly speaking, but there is an important yet subtle difference between the two. A must be true question is asking for something that is 100% guaranteed by the stimulus. In contrast, most strongly supported questions are asking for something that is not entirely guaranteed, but rather is incredibly likely based upon the stimulus. I think of it as a reasonable assumption given everything in the argument. Maybe it is 90 to 95% likely, but is not necessarily 100% guaranteed. And of course, you can distinguish between these two types quite easily just based on the phrase must be true or most strongly supported or similar in the question stem. Now, another mistake I see students making is that they're failing to consider the order of difficulty in the section. LSAT logical reasoning questions are presented in a roughly general order of difficulty over the course of the section, meaning the first 10 questions are going to be a lot easier than the next 10 questions and a lot easier than the last questions of the exam. So you want to approach the first 10 questions in roughly 10 to 12 minutes, assuming that you have standard timing of 35 minutes per section. You then build up a time bank to apply to the tougher questions later in the section. So first 10 questions, roughly 10 to 12 minutes. Then you slow down as you get into the increasingly difficult questions later in the section. I find that questions 15 through 23 on average are going to be the most difficult of the section, with the last few maybe being slightly easier. So you speed up at the beginning, then you slow down as time goes on. Maybe you want to flag 3 or 4 questions in that tough band of 15 through 23, but use this knowledge of order of difficulty to your advantage to go faster on the easier ones, slow down on the tougher ones, and also, of course, avoid getting bogged down on the most difficult questions in the section. You also want to know what are the question types that you are most likely to want to flag. Maybe you don't like parallel reasoning questions because they're very wordy. Maybe you don't like questions on hard science or philosophy because they're a bit abstract or tough to get a handle on. Know your question types, know what you like, know what you don't like, and consider flagging so you don't get stuck or bogged down, and work at a fast enough pace so you can trust you'll be able to go back to those toughest questions at the end. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to see it. I don't do any advertising for this channel. I rely only on word of mouth to help get the word out, and you are sharing this video with someone else who wants to achieve perfection on logical reasoning or as close to it as possible to get that 170 plus LSAT score. This video could really make a difference in helping them achieve that goal. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.